Hi, this is Wade Frazier. This is November 11th, 2025. I just realized this is the day Ed Herman died back in 2017. R.I.P. Ed, my Uncle Ed. Um, anyway, so the video, this is going to be the first in a series of videos that I have been thinking about making. Well, how to say it. I wanted to do an oral history a long time ago, 15 years ago or so. And also my work, it's not all just history. And uh technology has made it to where I can do this myself. And so this is quite a development. And so I'm going to make an oral history of a lot of things, but this one is an oral history of my adventures, but not just my adventures, my how to say it, anybody's adventure who tries to make a dent in this world, tries to make it a better place. And if they run afoul of the vested interest, I've called them rackets. I think they are. Yeah, so I don't know anybody who's trying to take on, and again, that wasn't their intent, was to take on the rackets. They didn't even know they existed at first. Um, but they went out there and tried to, alternative medicine, again, alternative energy. And then they had hell to pay. The approach I've developed over many years, I think, is one that people that I seek, those disillusioned idealists, um, if they follow my guidance, they shouldn't get into trouble. So I have a path to take, which I think will not get anybody in trouble, except maybe me. But at this point, I'm doing all right, so it hasn't gotten me in much trouble. So that's my plan. So we'll see how it goes. But this is going to be the various realities that people have engaged, myself included, when they go and try to bring disruptive energy technology to the market, or they try to, new alternative non-toxic cancer treatment. And those are two of many areas, but those two in particular are ones that, yeah, the medical racket and energy racket are the big guys. And anybody runs afoul of them, it ain't fun. Anyway, so here I'm gonna start this off now. So, predation. So predation is really very old. In fact, heterotrophs, those who don't get so autotrophs, there are chemosynthetic autotrophs and photosynthetic autotrophs who get their energy from either chemicals or the sun's energy. Plants are autotrophs. But animals like me are heterotrophs, which means that we get our nutrition from other living things. And the Cambrian explosion, which happened over 500 million years ago, that was really the rise of what we'll call modern-looking ecosystems. And from the beginning, they had apex predators. And so this is something that's how ecosystems on Earth work, at least these complex ones. And you have these predatory organisms, species. And the oceans, everything eats something. I mean, literally, there's the cyanobacteria, maybe seaweed that are the base, form the base of the food chains. And then from then, it's everything eats everything. Land's a little different with plants that have a symbiotic, flowering plants have a symbiosis with animals. That's the most important symbiosis between plant and animal is flowering trees, flowering plants. And as we get closer to the human journey, and so I'll cut to the chase here, chimpanzees, our closest surviving relatives, male chimps slaughter each other all the time. And usually the males of neighboring societies Sometimes it happens within the same society, but more often it's between societies, as chimp societies have war with each other and try to kill their neighbors off so you can take their land and their females, fertile females. This is it's a familiar dynamic. The hunter gatherers did the same thing, and to an extent, we do this today. Um, but then some apes learn to walk upright, etc., and stone tools and expansive brain growth, and Homo erectus. When Homo erectus appeared on the evolutionary scene a little over 2 million years ago, it was unique. It was the first mammal that was really bipedal, fully adapted for living on the ground. Had these big brains, twice as big as a chimp's brain, and they became apex predators with their sophisticated tool sets, ability to run, their intelligence, and so they became apex predators. And all the world's easy meat began dying off with the rise of Homo erectus in Africa, East Africa. And that's been a human trend to the present day. The 2 million years of wiping out big animals. In fact, 96% of the biomass, mammalian biomass on Earth is humans and their domestic animals. Wild mammals, particularly, are almost extinct. But human life was rough. So there were these moments that when they would first exploit an energy source, there was all these golden ages at the very beginning. It didn't last long. Two reasons. One is that when you had all of a sudden this excess surplus energy, life was easy. Eating was easy. But two things happened. One is that humans just then bred to the capacity of the energy supply. So they just bred like crazy. And then I'm saying they exhausted the energy supply. So whether it was megafauna or forests or soils or now fossil fuels, we just burned through one energy source, burned through the next one. This has been the human trend now for 2 million years. And before industrialization, life was, especially looking back at it from our perspective today, life was hard, really hard. The Hobbes versus Rousseau, fictional debate, Hobbes won. So yeah, life was rough. Life was really rough. Nasty, brutish, and short. Until industrialization, half the children died, and about a quarter of hunter-gatherer men died violently. Um, it was pretty, chimps. About half of male chimps died violently. Only a quarter of hunter-gatherer men died violently, only. And it's much shorter, but in the agrarian epoch, proportionally fewer people died of violence, but dying violently was always a risk for everybody all the time. It was just the violent world. And so it's not a big, how to say it, in that light, it's not that big of a surprise, I would say, that here I am living in Seattle, Washington, Pacific Northwest, in history richest, most powerful nation. And I'm a beneficiary of what's been called history's greatest crime, which was the invasion, conquest, and settlement of the Americas by Europe. Yeah, the Indians who lived here wiped them out, took their land. This is the human way, and so this was yeah. The Western Hemisphere lost maybe 95% of its population within a century and a half of Columbus's so-called discovery. And my ancestors were a part of that. So I have my family name. So I can't, my mother's side's from Norway and Sweden. My father's side is from the British Isles, mainly in northern, France. But British Isles and France is most of my father's heritage. And then they came over. In fact, my name as a Scottish root with actually a French spelling. Actually, French so Fraser is strawberry in French, and in fact, France and Scotland allied against England back in those several centuries ago, and England prevailed. And in fact, my ancestors became Quakers, which is this Pacific Christian sect. And I think it was, as my grandfather wrote once, it was they were tired of getting drubbed by the English, and so pacifism seemed like a good idea. And then my direct ancestor, Fraser, came over in the 1730s, which was about a decade before the Culloden battle, which actually there's a TV show called Outlander, which is kind of about my family. And but my direct ancestry came over before that. And then for the next couple centuries, wherever there was cheap, free land that the Indians had been dispossessed of, there my ancestors were taking advantage of all this free land. And they did it in Carolinas, they did it in uh, Indiana, Ohio, Indiana, and Kansas. And this was my that side of the family. And that's how and then during the Depression, they got dust pulled out. There were jobs actually in Washington State, in theory, in Bellingham, which is near the Canadian border. And that's where my parents were born and raised. And so this was, again, a great, awesome crime that was committed by my ancestors profited from in taking all the land, taking the whole continent from the original inhabitants. And today you can see like a replay of this in what's happening in Gaza today, or as the Israelis do to Gaza, not far removed from what Hitler did to the Jews. So the settler colonialism, yeah, this is an old dynamic. Um, the United States, and I've written about this at great length for many years. It's an empire. We pretend that we're not one, but we are. And the sitting president is effectively an emperor. And but as I learned, and I've written about this at length, where the sitting president really is a puppet with little real power, and that's particularly been that way since John F. Kennedy's murder. And I've written on this in great length, where one of my friends had the inside scoop on the Kennedy assassination 3 weeks after it happened, which is that Oswald didn't do it. So Oswald wasn't, in fact, he was part of a CIA operation to frame Castro for a fake assassination attempt on John Kennedy to justify an invasion of Cuba. And that's the end. I've read about this at length, so I won't cover that much right now. So this kind of criminality, if you will, is old, ancient. It's just part of the human journey. In my family, I have criminals and murderers in my family, and I don't think my family is that unusual in that way. There might have been, yeah, all sorts of that kind of stuff in the past of my family. I was a Boy Scout from the time I was born. In fact, I rescued all my immediate family members, and they all attacked me, disowned me, etc. And this was come to find out this is typical. And this is what happens in a world of scarcity and fear. So when you rescue people, quite often, oh, they want you to keep rescuing them. I discovered this. And then when you get tapped out, then they're indignant that you're no longer, saving them. But I was able to, partly because I'm a member of the most, I'm a member of history's most privileged demographic group, which is I'm a white, straight male American baby boomer professional. Yeah, the post-war boom was the most prosperous era in the human journey, which lasted until we started running out of oil back in the 1970s. We hit peak oil, and even today, like average American today consumes like 15% less energy than they did 50 years ago. So yeah, it's we've hit the wall, and it's kind of a slow motion collapse, but it's happening. Um, as civilizations have always collapsed and they ran out of energy. But again, being raised a boomer and stuff, I have really fond memories of being a young child. In fact, my introduction, the first time I can remember actual like violence, again, it was a violent act that I became aware of was when I was 5 years old, and my mother was watching my grief-stricken mother watching JFK's funeral, and I was only 5 years old, and I I really didn't know what it was about, but I could tell my mother was devastated. And anyway, that was my introduction to the violent American culture. And a few years later, my father worked at NASA, mission control there in Houston. One day he was at work, and 3 astronauts died in a training exercise. This is the Apollo 1 fire. And that drove my father from NASA. It became hyper political at that point. Everybody was trying to cover their backsides, pointing the finger at everybody else that they didn't want to be responsible for that catastrophe, which was, there was a lot of ownership of that catastrophe. And several astronauts had died in training incidents by that time anyway. So it was very dangerous to be an astronaut, particularly back then. And the United States was in the middle. This is now 1967. The United States is in the middle of an unprovoked genocide in Vietnam, which is, I would say, the greatest international crime since World War II. But at age 8, I was oblivious to that. I didn't have any idea about that when I was 8 years old. And then the next year, in fact, we moved back to California, lived in Ventura, California from then on, till I left home. Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King were both murdered about a couple months apart. And now I remember particularly Robert Kennedy's murder because it only happened about an hour from where I lived, murdered in Los Angeles. Around the same time, I remember there was a boy down the street who ran his bicycle under the street sweeper, died in the machinery. And my grandfather died around the same time. And he was my first close relative that died in my lifetime. I was 9, 10 at that time. And I later learned that grandfather was in World War I. He was born in the 1890s. And he was in World War I. He's in the trenches. He was first generation American, born in Minnesota. And he was in the trenches. It was in a mustard gas attack. But he was also nearly died from the influenza pandemic that, devastated the world back in 1918. In fact, I can barely imagine what trench warfare must have been like. And again, we're going to watch movies and sort of gets us closer, but yeah, there's nothing that can substitute for actually being at something like that. And what happened was when he got sick, they actually, and I can't speak for the level of medical professionalism of the time, but I guess they figured he was going to die. He had a temperature, I heard, of 106 degrees, and they actually had makeshift morgues there in the trenches, and they stuck him in a makeshift morgue, I guess figuring that he was going to die. So anyway, 3 days later, he wakes up in this makeshift morgue, surrounded by bodies. And he crawls out. So actually, he crawls out of this makeshift morgue in the trenches there and emerges from this makeshift morgue, which freaked out the other soldiers that saw this. I mean, it was this guy rising from the dead. And in fact, my grandfather, it crippled him. He got rheumatoid arthritis from that. In fact, his hands were like claws. He couldn't use his hands. And this is in 1918. And they didn't have physical therapy back then. But anyway, what happened was my grandfather was in a VA facility, a hospital. And what he did was every day he filled a big pan with hot water, as hot as he could stand it. And he thrust his hands into this pan and started prying at his hands to try to get them to recover. Well, anyway, it worked. So eventually he was able to regain the use of his hands. And every day for the rest of his life, he played a musical instrument to keep his hands, healthy. So and that was my mother's father. And then my other grandfather was in World War II, and he joined as a Seabee. Again, he was in his mid-30s. He had several children by that time. And anyway, he was Seabee. He was in Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Back nearly died. This is Sanders' story. Should have died, I would say, but it survived. And my father was in the Korean War. In fact, all my uncles, I only had one uncle of God, maybe up to several, like 7 or 8 uncles. Only one was as a soldier. And so I'm the first man going to my brothers were soldiers. So going to my family tree, I was the first man who wasn't a soldier in like in a century. And I almost became one because I was raised in a military household in a military community in an imperial nation, and I almost went to the Air Force Academy. And my mother, though, prevailed on my father to talk me out of it. My mother, she later said when my father came back from Korea, he was an emotional mess. And his father was an emotional mess, came back. His other father was a cripple. My wife's father was in World War II. Again, shouldn't have survived, head injury. In fact, the rest of his uh, uh, plane crew died. He was the only survivor of his crew. Um, yeah, men don't come back from war normal, healthy. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible thing to go through. And war is, as Tony Bennett said, warfare is the lowest form of human behavior. So yeah, war is a big blight, but it's born of scarcity. So that's in the end, that's what war is about, is scarcity. And so all wars, going back to chimps, take your territory, get some more fruit trees, take their females, this kind of thing. So when I was 15 years old, my first professional mentor invented an engine that was considered the world's best for powering an automobile. And by this time, he had been inventing for many years by that time. And what happened was the federal government actually spent like man years analyzing. In fact, Brockett brought in a rocket scientist to actually assess it. Got a rocket scientist to actually help save the space program. And he became the greatest champion of the engine. In fact, Senator John Tunney helped him enter at home a few times to have congressional hearings about developing the engine, et cetera. Um, and but during a meeting with government officials, a high-ranking official told my mentor that uh, if you think you're going to make the internal combustion obsolete, make your funeral plans now. And he didn't tell me that for many years later, but this is some of the reality he started to broach on. In fact, he invented a bomb that exploded into a highly magnetic, highly abrasive dust, which would actually destroy all machinery and weaponry and wouldn't hurt people. And the Pentagon quickly suppressed that. Back next decade, you start hearing about neutron bombs, which is the opposite idea: preserve all the infrastructure and kill all the people. That's the military mentality. Um, that engine started making the news when I was 15 years old. In fact, that's when I got my first energy dreams. And in fact, that rocket scientist and my mentor, when it became a big deal, there was an industrialist in LA who offered to found a company based on that engine to build cars with that engine. And the industrialist said that he would own 95%, and my mentor and the rocket scientist would split the remaining 5%. And with a deal like that, they said, oh, we're not interested. And that was the end of it. However, I believe it was that industrialist. They stole the engine, built a prototype, and drove it in the Rolls Parade several years later. And this is like in the mid to late 1970s. And they were going to transform the auto industry. And as I'll get to later, I think I heard of the fate of those thieves. A bigger predator devoured them. That's another story. But my mentor, particularly after they suppressed his, bomb that destroyed weaponry, he once told me that he'd be in these meetings, planning meetings, again at the Navy, and these meetings would be full of euphemism and technical talk. but the meetings are all about how to kill the most people in the most effective way. And in fact, I was reading something recently about this. This was common. This was in that world when people are planning, again, genocides and slaughtering millions of people in nuclear holocaust, etc. It's always this euphemistic technical talk. Yeah, they always put everything in euphemism instead of like you were discussing some kind of science project when you're really talking about slaughtering millions of people. And in fact, my mentor realized at some of these meetings that if he wasn't, figured he was going to lose his soul if he stayed with them, because then he would succumb to it, and he'd just think like they would. So when he got out, he got out of the military not long after that, and his and I've said this before, if any of you watching have a cell phone, well, you have a circuit in it that makes sure that the battery never overcharges. You can just plug it in like I am right now, and it never gets overcharged. Well, my mentor invented that circuit back in the 50s, the 60s, I mean. And that circuit back. So billions of people use my mentor's technology, and he never got a dime of credit, dime of recognition. Yeah, the guy from Lockheed stole it. And anyway, this is the real world of inventing. And yeah, inventors don't get rich inventing. It always gets stolen or suppressed. This is, in fact, every one of my mentors' inventions was either stolen or suppressed, or both. In the instance of this engine, and both happened. The thieves got suppressed. So anyway, that was my youth, and so I mean, it's an aspect of my youth which is relevant to what the story you're going to be listening to. And then what happened is that, and I've written about this, I don't know how he recovered, but I had my mystical awakening at age 16. Same year that I got my energy dreams. Eventually, a desperate prayer changed my voice in my head, spoke up and changed my studies from science to business when I was 19 years old. And then I went to university and, record test stores and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, and then I started my career, except I got out of college in the worst recession in 40 years. I got out of college in 81. And in fact, tried to move to Seattle, where I'm from. Couldn't. They couldn't make it happen. Worst recession in 40 years. So I crawled back down to Los Angeles and began my career there. So I bounced around the West Coast a bit, trying to find my way. And one thing that happened during those years, which is relevant to what I'm about to recount, was one of my close relatives I learned was a CIA contract agent who actually worked for Henry Kissinger. And my relatives never knew that I knew about his secret life, because what happened was I heard from his ex-wife about his secret long after I had no longer really had much contact with this relative. And like the only reason she found out was that an operation he was in went bad, and he had to have a bodyguard for a while. So he had to explain a bodyguard to his wife. So he brought her in. Years later, she spent an afternoon telling me about the secret life and what he did. And he worked for Henry Kissinger when Kissinger had no official role with the American government. And probably Wally did also, but when I became aware of it, he had no role with the government. And everybody involved is long dead, but my spook relative has living relatives who may not know about this part of his life, and it's really not my place to reveal it. So I won't reveal his identity publicly. But I will talk about what I learned about his spook life, which was, it ruined his life. And so it was a spook. And then what happened is that the CIA, and the CIA has been privatizing covert action since the overthrow of Iran's government, which the John Perkins was taught as an economic hitman training. And so he was a contract agent, and actually just sort of, we'll say, part-time. So what happened was he would actually try to have a job, a career, and then he'd get the call to go play spook. And so he'd be gone for a week or two. And then, well, and usually unexplained absences. He'd try to feign being ill or whatever, but he couldn't. Anyways, he kept losing his jobs. and so he really couldn't have a career. And so then when he was losing his jobs, his handler would give him enough money to get by. But he was always, in fact, when I knew him, he was deeply in debt. So anyway, it was not lucrative to be a part-time spook working for Henry Kissinger. And they actually built on this whole mom and apple pie. In fact, I'm sure he was recruited with this macho James Bond Patriot pitch to do this. But he killed people, and so unless you're a psychopath, you don't kill people with a clean conscience. And in fact, one time he actually one of the members of his team was a suspected double agent, and so he was told to kill him, and he did. And in fact, he told his wife, he goes, I didn't want to kill the guy, but orders are orders. It's kind of like the mafia. Business is business. So anyway, so he goes and he kills a guy on his team. I don't know how he really killed, but I know he knew how to use like every weapon you could imagine. He was like expert in it, etc. So this was his other life. It ruined his life, and again, unless you're a psychopath, that's not easy. So my relative basically drank himself to death, and amongst spooks and special forces and this kind of stuff, guys who are violent for a living, drinking yourself to death is a common fate. Very common face. So anyway, yeah, so our relative basically drank himself to death. And I don't think he ever figured it out that he wasn't one of the good guys. Ralph McGehee, his moment of awakening in Saigon there in 1968, he was Curcia, and he finally realized that he wasn't one of the good guys. As he's looking at pictures of napalm children, etc., he finally realized that he wasn't one of the good guys. In fact, almost killed himself the night of his realization. And I was actually born in '58. In 1973, the Vietnam draft ended, and so I lucked out. Well, again, I almost went to the Air Force Academy, but I was 3 years removed from the draft ended 3 years before I would have been drafted. And so I didn't get drafted. So anyway, so I was never in the military. So lucky me. But I have, again, I mentioned my relatives, all were soldiers, and I have friends and family who served in Vietnam and in combat. And actually, I've never met a veteran who really wanted to talk. My grandparents, father, uncles, none of them really want to talk about their wartime experiences very much. It was obviously a very traumatic part of their lives that they wanted to put behind them, and they didn't want to talk about it, and especially those in combat. So so guys who've been in combat don't sit around the campfires telling war stories. It's not fun for them to remember that stuff. But anyway, so I got out of college, and then again, couldn't make it in Seattle. I ended up living with my mother for several months before I started my work in Los Angeles. And I worked in downtown LA, one of the big international accounting firms. And I had this idyllic university experience in San Luis Obispo on the Central Coast, not too far from Big Sur, Hearst Castle, etc. Yeah, pretty idyllic place to go to school. But then when I was in Seattle I had a brief period, I worked at a small CPA firm in Seattle, and I got to see homeless people, et cetera. It was my first really time working in the big city. And it was a sobering thing. But when I worked in Los Angeles, I worked in Skid Row for several months, my first year or so. And that was like working in hell. That was, wow, that was brutal. That was really hellish. And in fact, there's an anecdote. I don't think I've talked about this before, but there was a day when I was driving into LA, and this is now in like August, September, and back in the '83 in LA, the air pollution was truly awesome. In fact, LA was a place when I was a kid. I only went there when I had to. Ventura was only about an hour away, but you didn't go to LA unless you're going to a Dodger game or the airport or something. And anyway, one day I was driving into the office into Skid Row to work after I'd been working there about a month. And I worked in these skyscrapers. Well, you couldn't even see the skyscrapers until you're less than a mile away from them. The air pollution was so bad. And it was like driving to hell, and driving a scooter. Again, it's just it's like driving to work in hell. And one day I was driving, I burst into tears. I was like, I can't do this anymore. This was, yeah, it was so overwhelming, and I just burst into tears. Anyway, after that day, it didn't bother me again. I don't know. Something clicks in, and I've heard about this. Like if you go to the third world squalor nations and stuff, there you have shell shock until you get used to it. And so, but my drinking problems really began at that point. Yeah, it's really had sort of a drinking problem after that, which I battled with the body. I drank for 20 years of my life. I drank, and thank God I stopped when I was 42 in the year 2000, or else I wouldn't be here today probably. And so, but yeah, so working at Skid Row with just it's like working in a war zone. And in fact, I'll relate one anecdote which sort of gives the flavor of working at Skid Row. And so again, I was this mystical vegetarian guy. So I was forced to eat meat, forced to drink alcohol, forced to eat restaurants. This is part of the professional grooming. And one day, as we're walking to lunch in fact, we were at the redevelopment agency in LA, which is right down in the middle of Skid Row. And anyway, we walked across the street and walked 100 yards to eat at some little restaurant. And me and a woman I worked with. In fact, she was a black woman who was being used. It was this diversity stuff, right? This is 40 years ago. They wanted to have black accounting firms would partner with the big firms for auditing, like the cities, et cetera. It was a progressive thing, except she was on the plantation. In fact, I told her she thought that working with us would somehow further her career. And I told her she was just being used, as being this low-level clerk, and it wouldn't do anything for her career. And I had to tell her one day when she actually asked me. Um, anyway, one day though, she and I were walking to lunch and walk across the room and come around the corner, and there's a dead Mexican man right in front of us. I mean, we actually almost had to walk over the body. You could go to lunch. Like there was an LAPD policewoman standing about 20 feet away, probably making sure nobody looted the body. Anyway, so there's first dead body I ever saw. He just died. And so we're walking around the body and go and walk 50 more yards and go in to have lunch. And you didn't talk about it, so we didn't talk about that dead body we just walked over. That was life in Skid Row. And yeah. Oh, oh, oh my. Those were brutal, brutal days. And anyway, then it turned out that the profession I was in was worthless. And I've written about this. I think a video I wrote about this, but I was an auditor. You're basically, profits are the holy grail of capitalism. And so, the job of auditors is to make sure the financial statements didn't overstate the profits, that, everything was stated fairly. The problem was, though, is that they're auditing for people that hired them to do the audits, so they couldn't be independent. And then there were repeated accounting scandals. In fact, the savings loan scandal I saw before it became a scandal. But again, all the banks were cooking their books to hide their losses, and all the auditors were signing off for the big audit fees. Yeah, it was all it's called a racket. But anyway, and I asked that naive question in my first audit class there, postgraduate, like, how do we benefit society? And everybody laughs at my question because you're told this the first day of auditing class, so that's the answer. Shut up. And but I later learned that actually that was a question we should have been asking, which was, yeah, we weren't benefiting society. It was kind of window dressing for capitalism to make it seem like it is regulated, but it wasn't. And this is one of many areas that corporate America has this sort of like fake regulation, it's really weak regulation. Like Ed Herman, he wrote about that in his career. Ed wrote about that, how corporate America is very lightly regulated. They basically captured all the regulators. And so, yeah, how hard is it to capture the regulator whose salary you pay? And that's what auditors were. So anyway, so and then in those days, I got away to the Sierra Nevada mountains as much as possible. I had some friends who lived in Bishop, California. In fact, he became the mayor eventually, but I did a lot of backpacking and got around the Sierra. In fact, I had unwitting brushes with death back in my young idiot days of being of doing very dangerous stuff in the Sierra Nevada mountains when I was young. And then in early 86, after 3 years of that, I felt trapped in my career, trapped in Los Angeles. Yeah, I wasn't able to get back to Seattle, which is that's where I wanted to live. And anyway, then early 1986, uh, one morning, again, after I was leaving that accounting firm. I was so loyal that they let me go on my own. I didn't have to show up to work, be paid till I found something. Anyway, a desperate prayer was answered the next morning, which was like, now move to Seattle. Where do you have to leave? Anyway, a few days later, I was on the road to Seattle, and 10 days after the voice in my head told me to move to Seattle, I was interviewing at Dennis Lee's company. And the rest is history. But anyway, this is just a prelude to my adventures, my big adventures with Dennis and afterward. So that's all for now.